I want to tell you a story. I have a little bit of data, but it's mostly a story. And mostly what I want to get is your expertise. So the simple part of the story is that about a year and a half ago, I helped make a MOOC. And it led me to realize that I could dramatically transform the class that I regularly teach. I've been teaching class for about 15 years, and there were sort of itchy problems that had bothered me all these years, and I had no way to fix them all until the MOOC came along. So I want to tell you a little bit about how the MOOC made it possible, what I did, and what I and some of the students learned from that. And again, it's supposed to be mostly discussion. So my main goal is to present some things to start a conversation, because it's clear you all have a huge amount of experience. And what's also interesting is that people have spots of experience, little bits and pieces, and I think the neat thing is we'll be able to put them together. So I will try to say as little as I can, just to provoke, I hope, an interesting conversation. So the plan is this. There's three main things I want to have a conversation about. And for each one, I'll give an introduction to set it up, and then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll get back and do a little introduction, set it up. My introductions start longer and then get shorter. We may not do all three of them. I think they're all worthy topics for discussion. We'll have to run the balance between cutting off discussion and making sure we say all the interesting things. So for each of these, after I say something, these are just a place to get started in terms of what more would you want to know? Sounds like there's people interested in that sort of question. What questions and issues does this raise in terms of education and MOOCs and flipping classes and in the brick and mortar classes? And also what might happen next. And I'm sure you may even have other ones, but those are sort of guiding questions. All right. So I want to start with is a tiny little bit. My students, it's a first semester majors biology course. I've taught it for 15 years. I try to aim to cover less and have them understand more. The students are slightly non-traditional. UMass Boston's a commuter school and people going back to school. So they're not the sort of exactly average freshmen, but they're pretty similar. Mostly it has no prerequisites. So I've been teaching it for about 15 years, standard lecture and lab format, trying to be more interactive in lecture. But then this opportunity came along to, as they say, flip the class. And so just to say sort of why I did it, to start off get part of the conversation, is that this, right? The goal of flipping the class, what is the goal of flipping the class? The student should come to class prepared, right? The thing is, that's not a new idea, as people have been saying. Most of the stuff is not actually amazingly new. That, in fact, in the humanities, people have been expecting that you read Moby Dick before you came into class and talked about Moby Dick. But for oddly, in the sciences, we don't expect that people have come to class prepared. And so the main mission was, if I was going to be less glib, was to say that to do what is best done in the right context. So there's certain things that are best done at home and certain things that are best done in class, thinking in terms of various capabilities. At home, the main thing is they have flexible time. Right? They have as much or as little time as they need to get prepared, but I'm not around. In class, I have a fixed time, but I'm around. And so you want to try to divide up the labor in a way that makes best use of those two things. And so reading, watching videos, and doing warm-up problems are fantastic things to do on your own. If you can get it quickly, you can get it quickly. If you take a lot of time, you can take a lot of time. It allows for flexibility with students. In class, we have this group of people with a variety of different questions. And the same way you think about here, what's the point of bringing all these people together? Having everybody fly in here has a rather large carbon footprint. What do we get out of the group together that we don't get otherwise? And so to make the best use of that is these kind of activities that do in class, so that you discuss things, you can apply them, you can fill in gaps, and you can have the students ask questions. And to use the expertise of the instructor and sometimes to some extent your classmates. So these are what they've been calling active learning. And people have different levels of familiarity with that terminology. I want to, in a minute, sort of make it clear what I mean by that. But what having the MOOC content online allowed me to do was it left time in class to do these more active things, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So again, the key was the MOOC, by moving a lot of the lectures off into cyberspace and before class rather than in class, it freed up time to do other things. And so, well, let me be clear about what I had them do online, and then we'll talk about what happened in class. So there's I think, an important distinction. So my class was based on the 700X MOOC, an edX MOOC. And that was organized for no particularly good reason, like a regular class. It was weekly units with a couple of lectures and a problem set, and every once in a while there was an exam. That's just the way classes always work at MIT, so they sort of cloned that. Because I want these as preparation for every lecture, or not lecture, but for every class session, I had to reslice them. They're not weekly units, they're daily units. The other thing is, the problems are there to get you thinking about the material before you come in. right? I don't actually necessarily expect that you'll have got it all. And I don't expect, so I really all I want is that you have a thought about it some before you come into class. And so that we can fix any places there are trouble. So the assessment, these are not the problems and the problem sets become less assessments and or summative assessments and more formative assessments for the students in practice. And yeah.
Yeah, just the second bullet up there, the lectures, should that be ungraded? Test yourself questions?
So in the MOOC, they were graded.
Oh, those were graded?
Yeah, you had to get them right. Right, so in the 700MX MOOC, it was all the questions that were ever asked. You had to get them right to get credit for the course. Right, right. And so I relaxed that for the Spark. Right. Questions about that? Let me be clear. So the distinction between the two. And I make the argument that actually it's quite difficult to make a single online thing that does both, because you really think differently about the way you organize the content, and also you think differently about the questions. The questions are to get people to think about what they're doing and prepare them to come into class and use it, rather than necessarily find out whether they got it or not. All right. Yeah, sure. Diana.
When you say weekly units versus daily units, is it because you have the lecture every day or every day?
I should say that a bit more precisely. The SPOC units were sort of a week's, like we covered genetics or something in 3 lectures, and there was a genetics problem set. With the daily units, the way it is, it'll be like day 1 of genetics. This is a lecture to watch. And then we have some day 1 genetics activities. And then we have day 2 genetics activities. So it's a finer scale. Instead of sort of 15 or 10 units, it's like 30 units. Yeah?
Just to understand, did you take the materials out of the edX platform or put them in a different platform?
So I took them in the edX platform. They allowed me to reslice them. So I basically took the 700X course, the lingo would be, I put it in Studio, which is edX's editing thingy, and then I rearranged it.
So you didn't put it into your campus's existing?
No, because edX seemed to work, was easier to just to put it in the edX platform. Yeah?
Back to Sam's question.
Yeah.
So when you say daily units, you mean that matched up with the days that you were going to be teaching in class, not
exactly.
7 days a week?
Oh my goodness,
See how
yes.
daily sounds?
Yeah, I'm sorry. And so I should say, I don't know how to say this, 1 class worths of materials.
So instead of weekly, they were class-based.
Exactly.
Okay.
That would be a smarter way to say it. Right, thank you. Right. All right. All right, and so for what it's worth, let me show the next slide. So again, to try to be a little bit clearer, so for 1 session, so this would be a Wednesday, right? We were going to talk about parts of genetics. So there was a lecture to watch which had embedded test yourself questions. So these are questions, very simple questions. There were some optional reading. There were some warm-up problems. Again, these, in my context, they were low stakes. You were just trying to make sure that people had at least thought about the material before they came to class. And then there were some things for after the class, some books of practice problems, even some little like tutorial sessions and the like. All right, and so that before class, you saw the lecture, you answered a bunch of questions, and you had at least thought about it before you came in. And right. So what I want to do next is, again, because all of this monster amount of content used to be what I spent my time on, and now that was happening before class. I had all this time opened up in class. So what do you do with that class? Right? So again, it left me time for active learning, and there's many different flavors of active learning. I used actually a relatively rudimentary one. And what I was going to do was distribute clickers to you guys. I don't know how familiar I was asking the question. So I'm going to have people click in answers to show you what I mean by this, because I know some people know about this and some people don't. So what we'll do, we'll simulate clickers, which in a way I think might actually work better. So in what clickers are, well, actually, you know what? I'll ask the next question. Let me know where people stand. So A is 1 finger. You should pick carefully. 2 is 2 fingers. A is 1 finger. B is 2. C is 3. D is 4 fingers. So if you would, just hold up your hand with where you're at in terms of, if you don't know, it would be a 1. All right, so there's a mix of things, all right? So the advantage of clickers is each of you guys, so there's actually, most people have heard of them. For those of you who haven't, what you would have in your hand is looks like a TV remote control with 5 buttons on it, A, B, C, D, E. You would beam in your answer, and running up in the corner there would be a time clock and a tally of how many answers came in. And when I said, okay, we're all done, I would hit a button and we'd see a little bar graph of how many people gave each answer. Right? And that has several important things, but I want to do a sort of better demonstration of that in a second. So again, just to be clear about the kinds of things I did in class. Right? So I wanted a biologist. I wanted to pick a topic that I took a guess that many people would be at least sort of familiar with. And so it was a sort of web-based thing. So imagine you had all as your assignment watched a lecture about how HTML, which is the language of the web, how those tags work. And rather than lecturing about that, you guys saw that lecture. So we come into class, and I would ask you a question like this. And the way HTML, just a very brief thing, HTML tags, that says underline, that says stop underlining. All right? So there's many ways to do this, but rather than explaining it, right, the canonical way to implement this is to have everybody vote. Beam in an answer without talking to your neighbor. It's commit to an answer, right? And then talk to your neighbor and then vote again. For time purposes, let's just do the finger thing, right? So you tell me if that little U in the bracket starts the underlining and the little U on the slash ends the underlining, which is the right answer from all of those? And I mean, you can raise your hand when you put up.
Can I do an F for none of the above?
I don't, oh, it's none of the, all right. Oh, it's none of them? Did I get it wrong? All right.
Yes.
I did.
Because the W is lowercase.
Don't. You're right. So that was actually meant to start discussion. No, so yes, all right. So I think we can. That simulation has now made its point. So so actually there's, well, I'll stay out of that particular place. But what this gives you is two things. Especially if you had clickers rather than fingers, is feedback. You immediately know, because I'm going to tell you the right answer. I was aiming for B, forgetting about the capital W. All right? It gives you feedback whether you got it right, also where you stand relative to your peers. It gives me great feedback about where people stand. Right? So if I need to do some, at this point, I could do more explaining if lots of people got it wrong. If most people get it right, I can move on and do more questions like this. The students find it nice because typically they get it right, and then they know they're doing well. It also provides anonymity, right? In this room, it's probably not nearly as big deal, but nobody wants to be the one with two fingers up when everybody else has got five, right? That's very socially unacceptable. And notably, raising your hand for yes or no, you do not want to be that one person with your hand up in the room with everybody else has their hand down. So it provides the students with anonymity and me with feedback. And in my class, you get credit whether you get it right or wrong. Basically, I want people to think about it. And so that's a simple sort of effective tool for this. And so that is what we spent time in class doing instead of listening to me lecture. Right? Series of questions like that. I won't say much. This was, the earlier speaker talked about this in detail. It's a strong evidence that this really works. So I will skip ahead of that. So I will not say much about that. So the question, so I've been saying that using the SPOC, the MOOC, to put content online, freed up time in class. Well, so how much time did it free up? So there we go. So these are two, we took some video of class and over the semester, and we logged the percentage of time spent lecturing. And the blue are different flavors of questions. Either one instructor used the clickers and one didn't. Traditional 2 is me, traditional 1 is somebody else. As you see, most of the time I spent lecturing, right? And there was a little bit of Q&A. This is sort of what I was able to squeeze in bit by bit, year after year. All right, so but mine, those are pretty similar. So my question is, another way you can do is sort of use clicker questions, for what it's worth. I'm sort of a big fan of them. Is you can use, there's not a right answer to this question, but you can sort of provoke discussion, right? So you tell me, think about it for a second. Where might you weigh in? How low can you go? I was at 65, 70% content lecture. How low could you, but imagining you're trying to implement a class, how low in terms of lecture percentage could you imagine going and still sort of have it function, roughly speaking? So give me the finger thing and see where you stand. So there's 10%, there's a lot of 2s and 3s, it looks like. So yeah, so in that neighborhood, all right? It's because you got it, there's presumably some explaining that you got to do. And so I can show you the data from my class is it came out like this, that it's sort of 25% was, and that part of it is as a teacher I can't resist blabbing, but in the end there's a certain amount of filling in the gaps when it's clear that they didn't get stuff. There's a certain amount of wrapping up conclusions because the time we count in the clicker questions the time it takes to introduce it and to to answer it. But if you need further lecture to explain, then that was kind of in there. And so it dramatically changed the time allocation in the class. All right. In terms of evaluation, I have a tiny little bit of data. So I can tell you what the students thought. I asked them, you guys have taken, at the end of the semester, you guys have taken lots of classes. You've probably been in chemistry, which is taught conventionally in my class, which is taught with a Spock. What should I do next year? And they sort of bite. Definitely Spock is 10-fold higher than definitely conventional, and the trend is that they really loved it. So I had expected resistance, but they particularly liked it. If you look at why they liked it, I think it's sort of instructive. Some grad students in my lab are trying to tally this up a little bit more detailed. This was just a sort of quickie. But you can group these in different things. In terms of what people mentioned, they really liked this online lecture business. And this caused me to think a lot about it, because I'm used to thinking that my lectures are super vital, and that the online lectures are a poor substitute. But the answer is they're fantastic. They can be better than me live, because they can stop and fast forward and go back through the equivalent of saying, can you say that again? Can you say it again? Can you skip over that boring part? And Eric can ask for a different part than Melanie would, right? And so that gives them the flexibility. And not only at their own pace, but on their own time, when they have time to do it. They like the problems as well that were embedded, both the rapid feedback and the questions, right? And this gets to the same idea, the idea of active learning, which is that the notion of active learning is after you pick something up, you read something, you hear something, you use it in some way. You exercise it, and that helps them to learn, and they recognize that. And that also that what went on in class was something that they found was productive. All right, and the last thing I want to say before I want to have a conversation is the grades. And so I was able to give the same final exam 1 year before and the year I flipped the class, and the difference is not significant. And my first thing was, I'm supposed to show an improvement. Why did I go through all this trouble if I don't get an improvement? And there's a couple things. One is as you see, I lectured 1/3 as much. I essentially, to a first approximation, gave no lectures on that material, and they did just fine, okay, which is, I think, an important point. Second thing is, in blue is a course that I've been shining up for 15 years. And in purple is the course was the very first time. And my mission the first time out was to get the plane off the ground, fly it straight, and land it without blowing up in midair. And we managed to do that. So my sense is that the only place to go from here is up. Although, again, that would be conjecture. All right. So that phase one, the sort of changes to the class. What questions do you have? Yeah, Josh.
2 questions. Mm-hmm. Everyone thinks it's a good idea, right? Like, no one thinks it's not a good idea, but did you get an incentive to do this? Like, money, time off? I don't know.
No, I didn't.
And did you have, like, instructional design help, or teams helping you do all this stuff to transform your course and make it Spock?
So, no. There was a huge team to make the Spock, to make the MOOC. The transformation I did all myself. I am a sort of unrepentant nerd. I just like to do that kind of thing. And I have space, my teaching load is such that, and my research responsibilities are such that I have the time to do something like this. And it's
very scalable.
I know, that's the thing. Well, see, that goes to my last question, which is about dissemination. But could someone use what I've done, right, without having to redo it? But I don't know. But yeah, Ann.
Well, I would just say, as I said when we were doing our introductions, I teach a faculty development webinar. It's a webinar. We have 24 campuses. I get about 50 people every time we do it, once a semester. And it's not rocket science. The MOOC part was.
Yes.
But, and I always tell faculty, take baby steps anyways. Ease yourself into this. We give them the basics. And there are people certainly on campus available for consultation, our teaching and learning center and so forth, but it's not the kind of they usually don't need the kind of major involvement from learning designers and others as they do when we're developing a fully online course or a MOOC.
Well, and also, I made my job harder because my contribution to the MOOC was a whole bunch of software simulations that I had developed, which were a real pain to build in. If I had just been doing sort of your classic multiple choice questions and videos, which actually you can get a ton of mileage out of, especially if your goal is not to teach all this, but just to set people up for class, then it would have been a lot easier. Other things. Yeah, Melanie.
How did you introduce the content? Like, how do you frame it? Was any face-to-face time used to set that up, or was it just go watch someone else's lectures? And the reason I'm asking is because I think earlier today in David Pritchard's other research section, he alluded to an experiment he had done with his class, or separately, where he found that watching the lectures and then coming to class and doing more sort of active problems together, he was not seeing as much learning. And I wondered if it had, like, how was the content being framed? Were people just being told, like, go watch lectures, go read the book, or whatever, and were they not as excited? I don't know. So it made me wonder, how did you roll this out to students?
So what I told them was, so those warm-up questions and the like, my lectures at noon, they were all due at 11. So you had to, so for every day there were some questions that were due at 11. And so I just said the Spock is here. It's the material. It's what you need to do to get prepared. You need to get these points from these questions. That's that. So I didn't frame it any more than that. Eva.
Yeah, I'm not teaching myself. I'm Eva Steiner from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, and we are not a front runner in MOOCs, but we did a pilot MOOC a year ago. And the experience of the teacher I'm reporting here is that he separated in the online class, he just put the theory and maybe a simulation or something and some questions. And in the classroom, he took the examples and the cases and made people working on this. And with this strict separation, he had to work over his whole teaching materials, of course. But the effect was that now he has not to do much input in the online environment anymore, because what he is actualizing is the examples and the application cases.
I mean, you're just, it's the scalable thing is tricky. Although for what it's worth, once you do it, once I've done it, I can run it again and again. But the question is, if someone wanted to do it in biology, they could steal my stuff. But if, or take it, I mean, it wouldn't be theft. But if someone wanted to do it in chemistry, they'd have to roll their own, presumably, right? Yeah.
Well, the other thing I should add is we also point them, to all the how-to stuff for our LMS. Because that's a lot.
Right.
I mean, we're not telling them, oh, go create simulations or whatever. We're like, okay, you can do quizzes, you can do stuff for them, and we've got a lot of in-the-can self-help, kind of how to set that up. And most of our faculty are more familiar with that. So I probably made it sound like in 1 hour we don't do all of that.
How about other sorts of things that this raises besides those? Yeah, Michael.
It seems that you freed up some time to now have, say, deeper discussions about the material, but I was wondering if you also considered using that free time for, say, having them solve problems together in groups? Did you change the dynamics of the class?
So there are many more active things that people could do. There are case studies and a variety of things. I took a sort of low-tech approach, again, just sort of the first time out. Typically what I would have them do is I'd put up the question and have them discuss as a group, in little groups, not formal groups, but with your neighbors before we beamed in an answer. But yes, you could certainly do more things like that. And as time passes, I can add those things in. Right. Other things, yeah, Zaina.
How much of the online interactions, for example, discussion forums, if there are any, and for example, how many times the student got the question wrong, how much of that information did you use to inform your face-to-face?
Oh yeah, that's a very interesting question. I actually did none. There were, partly because I was so busy redoing what I was going to be doing in class, and I was typically doing it more or less at the last minute, that I didn't have time. Also, as you'll see in a minute, I want to talk about, I'm going to save some time for this, because of the way the questions were set up, everyone got them right. So they didn't give me any useful information. So there was, it turned, so that, but I'll talk to you about that. I want to make sure to talk about that in a second, but let me make sure that, Erland, you had a question.
A couple of questions. One, too, and this gets into our previous address that we had. Did you have to pay to license the MIT material at all?
Right, so again, so maybe I should be careful about what I'm a paradigm for. Because Josh will give me the evil eye for this one too, and rightfully so. I have a sort of special relationship with edX. I don't actually know what it is. I think I'm sort of a friend of the family, right? And so because UMass has not ever paid them any money, but I helped them with, and actually MIT paid me when I worked on the MOOC. So I don't, They are extremely nice to me, but no. So if another person wanted to do this, I don't exactly know how that would work. Right, Eric.
Does it sort of set up a model, and this goes to the effort to take it again? So there was the original MOOC, and then there's now your version of the MOOC,
Right.
and you could imagine, again, with respect to the previous talk, an open environment where people just sort of make different forks of this. Could you imagine a place where, maybe then each, as it sort of forks maybe 3 or 4 times from there, maybe there's different branches of it that people use in different kinds of ways, large classes, small classes, computer, residential. Do you sort of see that as a possibility?
Oh, I think that'd be a super idea if you could do such a. I mean, there's all the licensing stuff, but the OpenStax textbook people are trying to do that with textbooks. Is that people can make their own fork of the textbook? And what I thought would be actually even cooler is if you could somehow graphically represent that. Because if, for example, I noticed that someone has taken a fork of my course and like 10,000 people are using it, then I might want to look at what they did, all right? Or if I've made a fork of the textbook or the MOOC, and 10,000 people are using mine, I could tell that to my chairman, at time to get a raise or whatever. So there's lots of neat things about that. Right. All right. Yeah, Erlen.
So are the lectures in the MIT course, are they like 50-minute lectures?
Yes-ish.
Okay.
So some days Eric would get on a roll and would run over. And what they are, it's typically snipped up into 5 to 15-minute sections with a question, with a little question embedded. Right. All right, let me go on. Oh, yeah, sure.
And also to do with reviews as well. So in the lectures, it wasn't you who was appearing there. Was there any sort of, how did your students perceive that as opposed to seeing you?
There's actually some interesting data I want to talk about in the next section. That's a good segue into what I want to say next, because it turns out to be sort of surprising. All right, so what I want to talk about now are there were lots of things I learned. There were 2 things that are intertwined. That it was really important to integrate all the pieces, all right? And it actually turns out that's what I'm spending this summer, is basically really making sure that integration works, because it didn't work as well as it should. And that low stakes, ungraded questions is a thing that I said a little bit about, but I want to say more about because I think it turned out to be really interesting. So I'll say a little bit about them, and then we can have more of a conversation about that too. So this is some data that I took. I surveyed at the end of the semester, asked people to rate on a sort of 0 to 3 scale. How useful were the following things in preparing for the exams? And there's a couple of take-home messages from this. One is that they generally found most things useful, which was pleasing. These are the warm-up and test yourself questions are the ones that were right in the MOOC, right embedded in the lectures. And so they found them useful because they were presumably right at that time, apropos, and right available as they watched the lectures. There were some other ones that were sort of external. They're part of the MOOC, but not nearly as much so, and they found them to be somewhat less useful. They liked the lectures, and this goes to Eric's question. So there were actually 2 kinds of lectures. The ones in this book were done by Eric Lander, and there were some by me. And because there were some of the topics in this box, some basic chemistry that Eric didn't cover that I needed to cover. And what's really interesting about the comparison with the way they found, and I think this is important, so the production values were like night and day. The ones on edX are fantastic. They have a transcript that you can click on. It goes to the part of the video. They're filmed by a TV crew, good resolution. They cut back and forth to images, this perfect audio. It's just fantastic. My lectures were this dreadful lecture capture system, right? So it captures, it has a video of me. Actually, it's a video of the podium, which I never stand at, okay? And then it's meant to do slide capture. So my lecture, when I lecture, when I would write on a tablet PC. And so it sort of randomly updates the screen cap because it's waiting for a slide. And so what will happen is I'll talk for 30 seconds, and then poof, all this writing will appear. So it's just horrible and awkward and needed a special plugin. But yet, they found them more useful. And I think that the message, and when I asked them why, it was because I delivered the goods, right? That is, I know what my students need and where they have trouble, and I can tune it to them. And not only that, I write the exams, so it's a good match to a better match to my assessments than someone else's lectures. Yeah, Josh.
I'm surprised.
Yeah.
We're surprised. We know that teaching is a relationship.
I know. You're right. I felt ashamed of the poor production values of my lectures, and so I assumed that it would be bad. But you're right. I think that's true. That the integration of those, my expectations in those, was more important than the video quality. So that I think was a big deal. They did Eric is a much more compelling lecturer than I am. But again, it was the sort of match between expectations and I mean, Josh, your question is interesting. What if it wasn't, the other lectures weren't BW, but somebody else, but was a good match for content? And that's, because there's two things you can't separate. There's the me that they know, the familiar guy, as well as the one who knows what they need. And so I don't know how much is me and how much of it is what I said.
I think they'd still be better with you as long as your lectures were lectures as conversation. And
Right.
it's clear that you were having a conversation with them when you're with them and when you're online.
Although, remember the lectures of mine, you wouldn't have seen me, so it was just a sort of disembodied voice. Right. So, all right, so there's a little more, let me say a little, the other thread in all this were ungraded problems. I was sort of vague about that. I want to be more specific. This is a little edX terminology. So you had to get them right, but after your first try, you could click what's called the show answer button, so you could see the answer. Right? And so the mission there was, what I've learned from my students is contrary to your sort of classic business reward model, the lower the stakes, the actually more thinking they do. When you raise the stakes, they panic, and they get exam anxiety, and they quit thinking. Also, I didn't expect that necessarily the lectures would perfectly make it clear, that they might come into class with some questions. So I didn't really feel right to demand that they get them right. And I really wanted to bring home this message, that they come to college thinking that wrong answers are a failure, when in fact the whole message of MOOCs and my class as well is that wrong answers is a learning opportunity. You get it wrong, you go back and watch the video again and try it again. So I wanted to give them that chance. And so again, like I said, they could just click through to the answer if they wanted. And in fact, that was the risk, that they would slack off when you lower the stakes, right? That they could, and that they might in fact learn, and that as it says, potential course collapse. The thing that I feared in last September was that very soon they would learn you could skip the lecture, click any random answer, click show answer, enter it in, and come to class, and you got all the credit you needed. And then I'd come to class not prepared. They wouldn't get my clicker questions right. I'd have to lecture, and then we'd get behind, and then it would be sort of game over. And so I was worried about that. And the answer, that didn't happen, but it almost happened. And so the key to understanding this business, I want to show you a little bit of our data too, is, and it goes to Zaina's question, because of that way it's wired up, I could not use whether they got the questions right or wrong as any kind of metric, because essentially 90% of the students got them correct. If they tried them, they got them right. So everybody got them right. The real question is, did they get them right before they peaked? Or did they peak before they got it right? And so it turns out you can look at logs. And so I thought I'd try, this is, I thought, was one way to think about how to introduce this idea. So if imagine I collected these log files, this would have been my last clicker question. So there are these time entries that loaded the problem, they submitted a wrong answer, they looked at the show answer, and then they submitted a correct answer to that same problem. How would you score that? Which of those 5 categories? And so again, A is 1, B is 2. You put up your fingers for what bin would you put that student in, and that student's response to that problem. So I got a 4, some 4s, 4s in general. All right. Okay. So that's what I was. This is a person who peaked. All right. It turns out this is actually simple. Most students' log entries are really long and complicated, and they involve multiple submissions. But that's the idea. So we were able to differentiate. And there were 5 flavors that any student's response to a question could be sorted. And these are all mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories. And so you can graph them 2 different ways. You can graph them over the course of this. Yeah, sure. All right.
Because they waited, between showing answer and submitting it, they waited some number of seconds, which means they maybe thought about it.
Ooh, right. So there's a ton of nuance that this does not capture, right? Right. Because we also tried analyzing how many attempts they take. But it turns out they do weird things. Like after they get it right, they'll submit it again a couple times. And that counts as multiple attempts. And so it looks like they tried all over the place, but really they were just submitting the right answer many times. So yeah, you're right. It turns out like any of these log entry things, there's a ton of nuance. That's interesting. But I mean, maybe they just went away and did something else. I don't know, went to Facebook. I mean, who knows what they were doing during those 24 seconds. Right. Or no, 14 seconds. All right. So if you graph by over the semester, so this is sort of problems over the course of the semester. This is work of my grad student, Nicole. the fraction of students on any given question, how they behaved. And what you see is it fell off at the end. And so they were well behaved at the beginning and they were less well behaved at the end. So this is the fraction of students getting it right without peaking. So the other thing is the mirror images, the fraction peaking went way up at the end. And if you asked, the material got harder, it was somewhat material dependent. It was later in the semester. Also, this material is stuff that I know how to support them in, and this material was stuff that I was new, I hadn't taught before. I think this is an extremely sensitive measure of when they feel sort of over their head, or over their, the water's in over their head, that they say, either like, oh, I'm too busy, I'm just going to click through, or oh, this is so confusing, I'm going to click through, or oh, there's too many problems, I'm going to click through. So sort of, it doesn't take much of an excuse. So this is really great for course development, right? Because I know I got to work here to support. There's also big holes in here. I got to figure out why they punted on these ones, but also things I can put in place to help them not do that towards the end. Yeah, Eric.
Another theory is just that as you get late in the semester, the students have a lot to do, and it's faster to peak.
Yes, and so, but then because if I imagine peaking is bad, then how do I try to put supports in so that doesn't happen? Right, yeah.
Is there a performance on the exam questions for that subject matter?
Oh my God, that is my next graph. But let me talk about that in a second. But before anyone's about this one, yeah. Erlen, do you have a question?
I mean, did spring break fall, right?
I gotta look. I forget. There were a number of. I think it's also people seeing patterns that when they're not aren't necessary. So I might have to look at it more carefully. There was also the more confusing lectures came in here. Zaina, yeah.
When we talk about peaking, can we use this to our advantage?
Tell me.
Offer a structured peaking where you give them the cheat sheet, so they have to read something.
Oh, okay.
In order to answer, so you help them peak, but under your.
But not like giving them the answer, but some hints towards the answer.
Just hints.
That's a neat idea. I mean, so there's one of the things to think about here is a bunch of different ways to deal with this. Another way I had thought of is that, for example, if you peak, you can get half or 3/4 or some fraction of the credit, so that you peak, you see it, but you still can recover some points even though you peaked, right?
Peak because
Right.
technically they have to read or do something.
Right.
I mean, if it requires reading and a little bit of understanding.
That's right, and peaking is not always necessarily bad. I mean, if you really just click through sort of mindlessly, that's bad. But if you peek and thought about why the answer was, because some peeking is not bad. If you peeked and thought about the answer and said, all right, well, you said thought about it when it's that business of coming to class prepared, right? So they don't get, I don't know why I got that one wrong, but now I got a question in my head. That's not necessarily bad. Right?
So I think this work
Yeah.
came out before adaptive hints were supported in the platform, and so like for future use, I mean, that's a whole different approach.
If you get it wrong, here's
If you get
a
it wrong, you get a hint that helps direct you to the right answer without
giving it away.
right or wrong or giving it away.
That's in a way sort of what Zaina was saying, a slightly different wrinkle. That's another neat idea, right? All right. So with respect to the question, it turns out there is a correlation. So like if you could, instead of classifying by problem, you can classify by student. So each point here is a student. And along here is the fraction of the problems that they answered correctly before they peaked. And that's their exam score. And in the education biz, that's actually pretty big correlation. Still not, it's not fantastic, but it explains 16% of the variation in their exam score. So that what I cannot tell you, because this is only a correlation, is that doing those questions diligently helped you to do well in the exams. It could also very well be that good students do well on the exams and are diligent about the questions. Nevertheless, I'm going to show them this at the beginning of the fall and say, which kind of student do you want to be? All right, but it could be one way or the other. And the other thing is, so what am I going to do about this peaking thing? I show them the data. I'm going to try to integrate better so that there's less of them when they come. There's less chances when they come to the questions they're going to go, oh my God, what has this got to do with? How is this related to the lecture I just saw? And I'm planning, what I've been building in is two levels of questions. Some core questions that are really simple, and you got to get them right and you can't peek. But you get 2 tries so that the message is, I got it wrong, I go back and watch the lecture, I try it again. And then every lecture to get ready, there's also going to be some challenge ones that are a little bit harder, and you can peek to at least have people have thought about it beforehand. All right, so the same thing. There's been some discussion already, but are there other things that this raises? Yeah, John.
So one thing in your time graph that you didn't show is how much time you now spend in class talking about your approach to teaching and how people learn. and, the whole metacognition thing.
Right.
Do you do that enough that it would actually be more?
You know, it's an interesting, I say a little at the beginning. But I'm always afraid that when the teacher does that, it sounds like the wah, 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 you know, that they don't, that I'm not sure when to say those things that they're going to be listening to me. So I should pitch it more, but I have not. But that also might make a difference as well. Yeah, in the back.
Just as an aside on the previous slide, I wonder if it might be worth talking to Mike Seema and seeing what he's been doing 3091X around questions and how many times people are peeking.
Oh, yeah. I'll have to make a note. I've met him, so.
Anything different, but I just sort of wondered.
Yeah. No, I think it turns out that those details actually make a big difference, because I think the problems are enormously important because they drive, they should, if you do it right, drive the video watching, right? So how you structure them is actually really important, right? Yeah. So, let's see. Next, behind Zaina, May.
You had mentioned better integration with the video and materials before the question that might cause peaking, but I also wonder about integrating the peaking prone questions into your clicker repertoire.
Oh, what a cool idea.
And
Okay,
so
right.
working it into class and doing peer discussion or something in class so you can sort of bridge that gap.
Yeah. Right, you could, right. If I could, right, and that would have been data I could have used in real time, right? That it turned out there isn't an immediate way on edX to do that, but actually right, I get that analysis, but if that would have been really useful real-time numbers, because if I noticed that people were punting on that question, then I better make sure to ask it in class, because for whatever reason it wasn't working right. That's a great idea, right? Yeah, Ann. And then Zaina, right?
A lot about, how do I make sure my students do the work they need to do before class?
Right.
And obviously quizzing them and making that count. And do you have any other strategies that you found successful in making sure they really do come class prepared?
Those were the only ones. I think that and I'm going to, this next time out is an experiment with the questions that they have to get right. And we'll see how that flies. I mean, in the end, for what it's worth, for much of the beginning, it was fantastic. I mean, I had expected to do clicker questions in the canonical way. You ask it, people beam in their answer, they mostly get it wrong. They talk to the neighbors, they mostly get it right. 70 or 80% were getting it right from the start. So I felt more or less that I was on a roll. Later on, things got to be more of a struggle. Yeah, Michael.
How many students do you have in your class?
330. Right.
Thanks.
Zaina, you had a question. I forgot. I'm
I
sorry.
was just wondering, because we're structuring content now for blended learning, so I was just curious as to, have you ever done the face-to-face before they were exposed to the online material? So use the face-to-face, as Susan said in the first lecture we had, basically give them the problem, give them a reason to look into the material.
That's a neat idea. I have not, although it has made me think I have to figure out how to implement this, but I was going to try to, what I've been encouraging the students to do is look at the questions first and then watch the video, right? So that you have that in your head, so you know what to look for. The problem is, how do you structure that? But I'm going to encourage them to do that as a way to drive their video watching. Right?
I would call it a teaser session.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea.
Just an idea that occurred to me.
Yeah, well, in the pre-MOOC days, I had tried that. I had done some computer simulation thing where they would try something and get sort of a weird, surprising result, and then we would explain it in class. And that seemed to work fairly well. It's hard to do that for everything, but that actually turned out to work. And those ones I would grade, you just have to try. And I think it helped some people come more prepared.
Just one more follow-up. I know that the technology is not available at edX right now, but do you think it would have helped you if there was a tracker that will show you that each student went through the video, went through whatever material you have on offer, and then you look at the dashboard before the class, and then you can see that, make sure at least that everybody went through the material, whether well or not well, it's not
Right.
right, but they just went through it, and then they know that you can know.
Well, that's actually so that's actually the question, that's another issue in this teaching these classes that it is tricky. Suppose people hadn't. What do? I do not wish to enable or encourage non-video watching, right? So there's this, because the way it manifests itself for me was, suppose a lot of people get the clicker question wrong even after I've done some explaining. I don't want to send the message that I don't care whether they got it right or wrong, but I also don't want to send the message that if you guys don't come prepared, I'm going to lecture anyway. So there's this sort of tension between, because the risk I have with that is, if everybody watches, great. If not everybody watches, what do I do? right? And so I could say, well, we're canceling class until everyone's watched the video, which would be sort of unproductive. But it's a tension that I haven't entirely worked out. The way I said it was, when most people are getting the clicker questions right, I would say, all right, so we're going to move on. And what I learned as I would walk into class, into the lecture hall, which I'd never done before, and I realized just how many people weren't getting it, which I had never noticed. I think it was always true, I just never knew. I think that there is a set of people out there who don't expect to get it even in that class. They're going to take some notes, they're going to watch the video and hope to digest it later. And so I hope that they do get it later. So not everybody's even going to get it in class. And so I'm going to allow some people to get it wrong. But it's a tension that I haven't figured out exactly how to deal with.
Just going through it.
I know what you're saying.
It's like attendance.
Right.
Like attendance.
So you could. So my problem is, what would I do with that information if that information was bad? Do you know what I mean? And I haven't figured out what I'd. Do you know? Oh, tell me what. Suppose you were teaching the class and no one had watched, or very few people had watched the lecture. What would you do?
Usually in Saudi Arabia, even at university level, attendance is a percentage of your grade.
Right.
So being consistently there enough will affect them. 10% of your grade.
Right.
Not necessarily a
Right.
large amount, but
Right.
it has consequences.
Right.
So if they didn't go through the deal by the assigned time, then
They wouldn't get points. Right.
some kind of consequence. It could be whatever. It could be the actual
Right.
grade or.
Although, here's the thing, and this is where things get complicated. I'm sort of agnostic about whether they watch the video or not. If they can answer those questions, then they're ready to come to class. If I get the questions right, it should be that even if they didn't need to watch the video, if they could get the questions right before they came to class, I don't care if they watch the video or not. Plus or minus. I mean, I think it's probably worth their time, but if they know it. So it's complicated, because some people I don't want to make them watch it because maybe they don't need to. All right.
Maybe you can give them their 15 and they can miss 5.
That's true. That's another, right. Or also as a bonus or something. That's right. Ann, you put your hand up.
I think I'm on the same page as you. I mean, you've got to make it hurt.
Right.
You've got it, however you're going to do it, you have to make it hurt, or else they won't do it and they won't come prepared and everything kind of falls apart.
Well, but remember, the bottom line is coming to class prepared, not watching the videos, not, do you know what I mean? So, right.
But I mean, even
Right.
the questions, so the whole like hinting and not hinting and
Yep.
all of that. You have to factor that in. What I was another model that I know Eric Mazer has talked a lot about when he speaks publicly about the flipping he does at Harvard, is having students help one another in the class. So
Right.
you ask the clicker question,
Right.
but before you show what the right answer is, you said, you can show the results.
Right.
Not say which one was right, and then say, okay, talk to your neighbor.
Right.
And try to convince your neighbor that the answer you gave was the right one. And he said it's been amazing to see that the students that are right are much more successful at convincing their peers of the right answer than he is.
Yes. No. So
And then you're not re-lecturing.
right. So that's another yes. So that's another interesting solution to the problem. So you don't have to worry about. And also that makes students accountable to each other, because if if you're constantly coming unprepared, then you're sort of a drain.
Yeah, and then your
Right.
peers are going to give you a really
Right.
hard time.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion, we had videos which were interactive with some multiple choice questions. And the video just wouldn't continue if you do not fill this in.
Oh, okay.
And
That's another one.
if you're not correct, it says it's not correct, but you can repeat that, and that's very
So you
easy.
could oblige
You
people.
get the rest if you are doing it.
Marcus, did you have something? Yeah.
Just to return on the question, how to make it work. In the Asian context, in the Asian culture, no one wants to stay out. So what we usually do is, like in the beginning, we have to say everyone has to be prepared, and then you do randomly walk through the class and ask the students to explain some of the content. And this is how we make it. Let's say
Make people accountable.
just taking the attendance doesn't have a dashboard. We don't have a dashboard, but we do it this way. And
So I've tried things like that. What's interesting about that, the sort of cold call, I tried to do that in my class, because that was where I learned a lot about the low stakes being important. I tried to make cold calling as painless as possible. So it was never going to be, Marcus, what's the answer to this? It was, let's talk, here's a question, think about it, talk to your neighbor. I'm going to pick a random name, and Marcus, you report for your group. Right? So it's not. So the thing is, even then, what students would tell me is nobody thinks. They just listen desperately to an answer that sounds right in the neighborhood because no one wants to be the one who stands up and says something stupid in front of 300 people. And so so that was one of the things where my take-home message was lower the stakes and people think more. But then you have the problem when you lower the stakes, they don't do it. Right, so there's a sweet spot maybe. Yeah, Josh.
So what year will every large lecture STEM class in UMass Boston be taught in a blended?
I've missed the very beginning.
What year? In what year will every class be
Ooh.
like your class?
Well, you know, that segues to my last question. The last thing I want to discuss. I might as well put it up. So there are two, which is the first part there. So there's two phases. There's adoption. Who should do this? And it's not. I'm not positive, and it's a question that I'll just leave these out. We'll do the last 5 minutes talking about these things. I'll turn that question back to people. Should it be that every class be flipped? Should some classes? And I don't know the answer to that one. And then which courses? And then there's which we started talking about earlier was this question of implementation. If you wanted to do it, what would it take? And how? So, for example, if somebody had a course a lot like mine, and they wanted to use my materials, how would they even find them? So I have no more to show than just that. So how about to Josh's question about? Let me change that question slightly to a question about: should every class be this way? Or yeah, May.
I'd like to suggest maybe reframing the scale of the flip from a full class's worth of content to any topic that needs to be moved outside of class for whatever reason.
Okay.
So if you have a topic that you never get to because you run out of time, or it's difficult and students struggle with it in class and you end up, the whole class sort of fritters away, or it's foundational and half your students know it and half of them don't. They're all really good reasons to do something outside of the classroom. So sort of viewing flipping maybe as something with a variety of sizes.
That's a really good point because that's another way to make it. People make a barrier because you figure you have to flip your entire class, right? And so I would add another one to the list. There was a bunch of lectures that I found really boring to give. It was kind of like reading stuff into the record, and it was really a pleasure not to have to give them anymore. But then we ended up doing much more interactive sessions on them. So there was and so yes, that's another way to look at it as well, is to break it up. How about other things? Simon.
For example, when we have content providers who are providing the content for us, our guideline was 25, 75. As 25 minimum face-to-face interaction.
Okay.
And then depending on the content they're developing, some of them end up doing 40, 60%.
Okay.
But it's quite rough, but just
Right.
to give you an idea, some of them 50-50, depending on what kind of content. So it's the content that is driving it.
Right. I mean, in the end, you want to get the message across clearly to your students, and maybe it's not always the best way to go. Right. All right. Yeah.
As a faculty member, lecturing is such a bad word these days.
I know.
And you know, I feel like some people are really at their best when lecturing.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not going to be the kind of people who want to manage these discussions. So, and I don't think you hear that very much, that it's not always about what's the learning model say, but what process works best for the faculty members.
That's absolutely true. And there's two pieces to that, I think, because there's maybe if you had that faculty member earlier, it could train them differently. They might be different. At this point, it's hard to change. But it's also true because I remember I worked at MIT as an instructor for a while, so like a head TA. And there were some lecturers that their Blackboard technique was just, I don't know what the adjective for it was. Their paradigm was you wrote words on the board. What you wrote on the board was what was hard to spell. Right, which is a paradigm, but it's insane, right? And so the students would just go bananas trying to take notes from them. And I thought, the thing is, though, this lecturer was a fantastic storyteller. And it came to me that I probably couldn't, but even if I could get him to write more on the board, he would probably just become boring, right? And so you're right, you have to work with what a person's skill set is. It shouldn't be an excuse for not changing, but it's also true that there are things that some people are good at and comfortable with. And not everybody's going to make this fly. That's absolutely true. Right. All right. Maybe time for a couple more. Are there a few things? Yeah, Erlen.
So the idea was to get students prepared when they come to class, and presumably they came more prepared because they did more work outside of class. Was there any pushback? You now invaded their out-of-class space that came with this?
So that's another really good point. One of the things I wanted to be really careful about was not like doubling the course load. It's like, oh, I've moved the content, now I can teach all this new content in class, right? Now that'd be twice as much material. No. I think there was not. My sense is they were probably doing very little outside of classwork in the past, and it was pretty unproductive, right? That the students, many students would come to me and say they were struggling, they were studying, but they weren't doing well in my exams because they didn't know how to study. So I hoped in some ways that learning to extract information from a video and reflecting on questions when you're watching a video might be skills that would help them in other classes. So I didn't get grief about that. I know other people have, that they feel like you've added to their workload. I don't know whether it's the culture of UMass. The students tend not to complain. It's also perhaps that they were freshmen, so they didn't know what college was yet. It was interesting that I didn't get grief about that. All right. Yeah, last one.
Do you have a 5-course or a 4-course load?
You mean what I teach? No. Oh, the students. They'll typically, science majors will take between 4 and 5 courses.
The difference is that the Ivies have 4 courses. Most of the private schools have 4 courses. Most of the public schools have 5. The official logic at the University of Maryland, where I teach, is that students are supposed to put in 3 hours outside of class for every hour
in class. Yes.
Which means theoretically that they're working 9 hours, 2 hours outside of class for every hour in class.
Right.
Which means that a 3-hour class plus 6 hours of things is 9 hours, which means that's a 45-hour work week, and that's a hell of a work week. And
yes.
So the question about the flipped class is, how much time do they have to do it? Now the truth is that increasingly we find students don't do anything.
Right.
They don't prepare, and that's part of the great inflation and the dumbing down and so on and so on. But I'm wondering if this is somehow part of it.
So I have a tiny bit of data about that. It didn't show it, but every session I asked students to log how long it took them to prepare for that. And it was voluntary, and I told them, if you don't want to give me, I'd rather have no data than bad data. So if you don't want to say or you don't remember or whatever, just put -1 and you'll get your points for having put a number in that box. And so I tallied up all the non-1 answers, and it varied over the semester, but they were spending about 2 hours on average. So about 60% of the students reported on any given time. And the 60% that reported said they spent about 2 hours for each session, which is, I guess, about right for that.
They're not doing anything else.
Well, my students, a lot of them work because but
In other words, that doesn't include exercises, problems. The 2 hours
Right.
is specifically about the videos.
about the videos, but that was basically the extent of their homework. There was no other homework except lab reports. All right, we have run over, so thank you, everyone.